Hi Realtors, this is Lindsay Jackson, your Chief Advocacy Officer at ESCR. I'm here at the State House today to give you a quick recap of the 2020 legislative session. As of Thursday, September 24th, both the House and the Senate have gavelled out sine die, marking the end of the two-year session. It certainly goes without saying, but this year has been unlike any other. ESCR has worked very tirelessly to adjust and adapt in a very uncertain legislative environment. As you know, the regular legislative session was interrupted this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but both the House and the Senate have come back on separate occasions to take up very specific issues. Both bodies have come back to take up emergency DHEC funding, a continuing resolution to keep the state government running, absentee voting for the general election, and allocating CARES Act funding. Most recently, both bodies returned to take up budget legislation and any legislation that could be taken up under the sine die resolution, meaning any legislation that had passed one body. Major issues taken up over the past few weeks in the legislature include the second phase of the CARES Act funding. This provided funding for PPE for schools, virtual SC, and tutoring. This legislation included a tax conformity amendment that clarifies that PPP loans are excluded from gross income for state tax purposes. Another piece of legislation that was passed this week dealt with broadband accessibility. This legislation would expand broadband access across the state to reach even the most rural areas of South Carolina. In light of the current pandemic, access to broadband is extremely crucial for virtual schooling, job training, and telemedicine. So even with all the challenges that were thrown out with this legislative session, our Realtor priorities were not lost in the chaos. I want to quickly discuss our top legislative priorities this year, and I'm going to break them down into three different categories: taxes, housing affordability, and flooding. Our first piece of tax legislation is H 4431, dealing with business license fee reform. As you know, this has been in the works for many years. This legislation would standardize and simplify South Carolina's current system, which is very burdensome, costly, and complex to South Carolina business owners. The legislation would provide for a standard date and form, create a central payment portal, provide an equitable appeals process, and provide due process to taxpayers. A special thank you to Representative Jay Jordan, our bill sponsor, House LCI Chairman Bill Sandifer, and Senator Ronnie Cromer for their efforts in helping us get this bill across the finish line. This legislation will lessen the burden on South Carolina businesses and make South Carolina more economically competitive with our neighboring states. Our next tax bill is H 3596, dealing with rollback tax reduction. H 3596 has been in the works for many years. This legislation limits the current 5-year penalty to 3 years when land transitions use from agricultural to commercial or residential. A special thank you to Representative Stephen Long for his sponsorship and Senator Tom Davis for helping us get this bill across the finish line on the Senate floor. This legislation allows for property to achieve its highest and best use and allows for relief for current and future property owners. Now let's move into housing affordability legislation. Our first housing affordability bill is S 207, dealing with uniform assessment ratios. The original bill, filed by Senator Young, allows for the special 4% assessment ratio for nursing home residents as long as they are in the nursing home facility. This legislation was amended on the Senate floor to also provide language dealing with tax increment financing for affordable housing. This allows financial aid for development or infrastructure improvements. The amendment extended this funding to include publicly and privately owned affordable housing. A special thank you to Senator Paul Campbell for his efforts on this legislation. This legislation expands marketplace engagement and provides more accessibility for housing affordability projects. Our next housing affordability bill is H 3998, dealing with workforce and senior affordable housing. H 3398 creates a state tax credit for qualified housing projects to match the current federal tax credits. This legislation will also allow for more private capital to address the housing shortage in the state. The final pieces of legislation that I'm going to cover today deal with flooding. Flooding has been a large issue on the local, state, and national levels. S 259 creates an Office of Resilience in South Carolina. S 259 creates a statewide resilience plan and allows the governor to appoint a Chief Resilience Officer. This legislation will help with flood control projects and is a first step in creating and maintaining a resiliency plan as a statewide approach versus just a local approach. A big thank you to Senator Stephen Goldfinch and Realtor and Representative Heather Crawford for their work on this legislation. S-217 deals with accommodations tax use for flood prevention. This legislation would greenlight the use of local hospitality tax for repair and control of flooding and drainage in tourism-related areas. This will help mitigate adverse effects of nuisance flooding in these areas. To wrap things up, this was certainly not the year we had imagined, but we were able to make some positive steps forward for the association and for the real estate industry as a whole. We look forward to carrying on these successes from the 2020 session into the sessions to come. I want to thank you all for your support, your guidance, and your patience as we've navigated through a very untraditional legislative session this year. We'll be back in January with our weekly legislative updates, and I look forward to seeing you then.